Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be with you in the University of Southern Carolina. The last time I was introduced like that, and I finished up with that I was interested in amateur bird watching, the first question in the question time was, what is an amateur bird? Looking at you, I see you're all highly intelligent and will ask me much more sensible questions. And what I'd like you to do is, during my lecture, that you write down questions that you'd like to ask on the topic, brief and short, and then at the end I'll explain how I'm going to deal with them. But because often when you're listening, something occurs to you and you forget it at the end. So engage actively in listening to the talk. Now, to every lecturer there belongs a biography, and I'm often asked why it is that I do this kind of thing. Why do I engage with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and so on in the public sphere? There's an answer to that, of course. It's because I'm interested in truth, which is the title of our forum, the Veritas Forum. I come from Northern Ireland, which hasn't always had the best reputation for Christianity, as you will know. It is a country where there has been a lot of violence, and my own family has experienced it. My brother was nearly bombed out of existence. And so when I arrived in Cambridge a long time ago, in the middle of the last century actually, one student asked me in my first week, he said, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have asked you that question. You're Irish, and all you Irish believe in God, and you fight about it." Of course, I'd heard that before, but somehow it presented an opportunity to focus and became actually my lifelong passion. Was my faith in God simply a product of Irish genetics, my parents believers, my grandparents and so on, or was it true? How would you test that? And so what I decided to do, virtually on day one at Cambridge, was to get to know other students who did not share my worldview, who hadn't Christian parents, who maybe were agnostics, atheists and so on. I've been doing it ever since. And the interest in atheism, coupled with the interest in languages, which has been mentioned, meant that I did research in Germany and learned the language so that I was able to freely move into Eastern Germany during the Cold War and actually see what happens when atheism becomes a systematic philosophy in the education system. I also speak Russian, so when the wall fell, I moved to Russia, to Siberia actually, but fortunately I got a two-way ticket. Was able to interact with people in the Academy of Sciences in many parts of the former USSR, talking to them about these big issues. And all the time the reason is Christianity true, or is it simply, as Richard Dawkins would say, the God delusion? And in Russia, you know, it was very interesting because I was a mathematician, they knew some of my work, and in seminars, they would be very polite and talk to me about my mathematical work, but very often they would say, "Are we allowed to ask any other questions?" And I said, "Sure." And inevitably the question would be, "We hear you believe in God. Is that really possible?" Now, can you imagine that in a math seminar in this university? It happened all the time in Russia. Because they were fascinated. How is it that somebody who's a mathematician, has committed their life to science, how could they possibly believe in God? Which brings me to my title tonight. Can science and religion coexist? It's a curious title, actually. Perhaps we should add to it, can they any longer coexist? Because they coexisted for a very long time. And as you will see, the question is based on a false understanding of what appears to many people to be an inevitable conflict between science and religion. So let's get into it historically. I love history, and I hope there are people, are you all science majors, or plenty of you from the humanities and the liberal arts, is that right? Yes. All over, that's wonderful, because I identify with most people, or I try to be interested in everything, which is why part of my activity is teaching at a business school, which might surprise you. So let's get into the history of this, because that's one of the ways of approaching the question. What does history tell us? What are the facts? Well, the facts are that modern science, as we know it, exploded in the 16th and 17th century with people like Galileo and Kepler and Newton and so on. They all believed in God. Now, that looks very remarkable from the perspective of the 21st century, when I'm told by Stephen Hawking, for instance, that science and belief in God can't coexist. Well, Newton was pretty bright, and he believed in God, and so was Galileo and Kepler and Clerk Maxwell and Babbage and so on. So I want to analyze this very strange situation. How it is that they believed in God, and how it is that against that historical background, someone like Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and the rest say that you can't possibly believe in God and be a scientist. Well, the first thing to realize is that scientists and philosophers and historians have been very interested in this connection between belief in God, Christianity actually, and the rise of science. And generally speaking, with various nuances, the conclusion is, as it was put by C.S. Lewis, men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. Why? Because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, far from faith in God hindering the rise of science, it was the motor that drove it. So the first provocative statement I'm going to make to you tonight is this: I'm not remotely ashamed of being a scientist and a Christian, because Christianity gave me my subject. That's the first point. And that has persisted until today. Look around the world and you see people like Bill Phillips, American Nobel Prize winner for physics a few years ago, who is a Christian. Your director of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, who once directed the Human Genome Project, a Christian. The Nobel Prize nominee, Henry Schaefer III, who is a quantum chemist of great genius, a Christian. So there are still people standing in the steps and in the faith of Newton and so on. I could name a whole lot of full chairs in the sciences in Oxford who also share my faith. Now the interesting thing is there's reason for that. Because these early pioneers of science thought science was worth doing. Why? Because they believed the universe was rationally intelligible, indeed mathematically intelligible. Why? Because they believed that behind the universe there was a rational mind. So that's what gave them the impetus to do the science. Indeed, even going more specifically, they also discovered in the Bible a mandate for doing science. One of the early things in the Bible, you may remember the story, was that God told men and women to name the animals. Now, taxonomy is a fundamental intellectual discipline. All of you in your disciplines spend a lot of your time learning new words, isn't that right? That's taxonomy. It's the discipline of naming things and so taming them. The interesting thing is that God said, go and do it and have fun doing it. That's why you enjoy doing it. Because you're made in the image of God to enjoy that creative activity, which is using your gift for assigning terminology to things out there. It's absolutely fascinating. And of course mathematics is the best of it, isn't it? Because mathematics is the highest art of linguistic compression you can get. You think Newton's second law has got 8 symbols in it, and you can deduce the orbits of the planets around the sun just from that equation with 8 symbols. That's pretty high-powered stuff, isn't it? So there's that connection through history. And If you go to Cambridge, the Cavendish lab, which has spawned many Nobel Prize winners, the most famous physics lab in the world, over the door you'll see in Latin and then in English, you'll see the words, "Great are the works of the Lord, sought out by those who take pleasure in them." To magnetism that no doubt you've enjoyed doing, some of you, in your classes. So that's the history. But why now the reversal? Why does Stephen Hawking say it's not God, but it's physics? More specifically, he said we don't need God, we got the law of gravity. Why has that happened? And what I want to do is to try and unpack that for you so that you can navigate your way around the debate. I'm not going to answer every question, but what I'm going to, and I couldn't anyway, but what I'm going to try to do is give you ideas that you might be able to follow in order to understand what is going on. By the way, that was an example of Newton's laws in operation. Now, let's move on to... You see, our title suggests there's a conflict between science and belief in God. That can't be right. It can't be right. And it should be obvious to everybody that it isn't right. Take Bill Phillips that I mentioned before, whom I know, the Nobel Prize winner for physics a few years ago. He's a Christian. Now, this year's Nobel Prize for physics was won by a Scotsman, Peter Higgs, of the Higgs boson. Have you all heard of the Higgs boson? Peter Higgs is an atheist. Now, what divides those two men? Is it their physics? No. They both won the Nobel Prize. You can't do any better than that. So here's one who's a Christian, the other's an atheist. That shows us where the difference is. It's not science versus God or versus atheism. It's that there are two world views and there are scientists holding on to each of them. The worldview, just for simplicity tonight, of theism, Christian theism in my case, and Bill Phillips, and the worldview of atheism. That goes right back through the centuries, and it might help us to grasp it if you think back to your lessons in Greek philosophy. There were the atomists like Democritus and Euclides who were brilliant. They gave us the idea of the atom, the atomos, the something that couldn't be cut. And they believed that ultimate reality was the void, empty space, and atoms. And as the atoms fell through the void, they formed galaxies, worlds, life, and the mind. They were the ultimate materialists. Now understand this, they did not believe in God, so believing that ultimate reality was what we would call mass energy, the nature of any explanation they gave of the universe had to be bottom up in terms of physics and chemistry, by definition. At the same time, there were people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle who said, yes, the physical world exists, but it's not the only thing that exists. There are the gods or there is God. And so coming up through the centuries, right into the academy today, we have these two major worldviews. And there are scientists on both sides. So what I want to suggest to you tonight is this. The conflict is not between science and belief in God. It's between atheism and theism, and there are scientists on both sides. You'll even find that in this room, actually. There will be people in different disciplines who are on the theistic side and those on the atheistic side. So we need to forget this simplistic notion that there's an essential conflict between science and belief in God. Now, the next thing to realize is that Richard Dawkins suggests that God is a delusion. So let's have a look at some gods who are delusions. I used to wonder why it is that people couldn't see the truth of what I just said to you, and why they say either God or science. And I located it in skewed concepts, I believe, of science. We'll come to those in a moment. But then it suddenly occurred to me that that wasn't where the first problem came. The first problem came in their concept of God. You see, many years ago, when I would talk about God to people, I could assume they understood what I was talking about. But now I can't assume that anymore, because many of my friends and colleagues who are atheists, they think that I believe in a God a bit like the ancient Greek gods, what they call a God of the gaps, which being translated into simple English means, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. You've heard of that kind of God, haven't you? Illustrate with the Greek gods of thunder and lightning. The ancients were afraid of thunder and lightning. They ascribed them to the gods. But if you do atmospheric physics at USC, you'll soon discover you don't need the gods. It's to do with temperature gradients, discharge of electricity, and so on and so forth. So exit the gods. So the idea is that the more science you do, the more gaps are filled. So in the end, there's no room for God at all. Now, the very important thing about this is the following. If you believe in a God of the gaps, then you have to choose between God and science, because that's the way you define God. Have you got that? Let me repeat that, because it's vitally important. If you believe in a God of the gaps, God is just an X to fit in until science comes up with an explanation, then of course you'll have to choose between God and science, because that's the way you define God. But you see, I've never met an intelligent Christian, indeed, or Muslim, or Jew, who believed in a God of the gaps. God isn't the God of the gaps, he's the God of the whole show. The bits we do understand and the bits we don't. Think of Newton. When he discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, wonderful, I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. That's exactly what Hawking says today, who used to occupy Isaac Newton's chair. I've got a law of gravity, therefore you don't need God. No, what Newton did when he discovered the law of gravity was write a book about it, called Principia Mathematica, the most famous book in the history of science. And in it, he expressed a desire that he hoped that it would persuade the thinking person to believe in a deity. You see, Newton was an intelligent man. And his argument was simple. The more I understand of the genius of the way it works, the more I can admire the creator who did it that way, not the less. And you know this is the way it is. I met a student coming in. She told me she's a student of fine art. Now, if she and I stand in front of a Picasso, well, I look at it and it's blobs of paint and so on, but because she's studied, she'll see the genius behind the painting. Some of you study engineering. And let's take a famous German motor car, the Rolls Royce. You didn't know it was a German car, but there it is now. I look at one of those and I say, yes, it looks very shiny and beautiful. But if you studied engineering, you can say, you know, those people must have been geniuses to make that limited slip differential or what it is, like that. In other words, the more you understand, the more you admire the genius of the person that did it that way. That's the way it works. And that's the way it works, ladies and gentlemen, with the universe itself. The more I understand of science, the more I admire the God who did it that way. Because you see, I don't believe in a God of the gaps. Now let's hone in on that, because it's very important indeed. Because coming to the science side now, just let's think about it. You see, that point I made about Newton, he didn't say, I've got a law, therefore I don't need God. In other words, he did not see God as the same kind of explanation as a scientific law. Now this is enormously important, so I'm going to give you a little talk now on the nature of explanation, if it's not too late at night to do so. But it's crucial. Science explains. What do we mean by that? Well, when I first came across Newton's laws, I was very excited that you could deduce all this planetary motion from them and so on, but I made a mistake. I thought Newton's law of gravity told me what gravity was. Doesn't, you know. Newton hadn't a clue what gravity was. Nobody knows what gravity is. So the law of gravity doesn't explain gravity. What it does is give you a mathematical way of calculating the effects of gravity, so precisely, in fact, that Newton's law is enough for you to send a person to the moon. Now, Wittgenstein, brilliant philosopher, made this point this way. He said, the great deception of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature. They are not, he said, they are merely descriptions. Now, that is very important, because when we hear science explained, to many people educated in the contemporary world, they think that's it. That's the total explanation. Science is the only way to truth. Science explains, therefore we need go no further. Now, there are two fundamental and very dangerous mistakes there. The first one is science isn't the only way to truth. That ought to be obvious to those of you who are interested in logic. Bertrand Russell, who was a logician and a philosopher and a historian of science, once said, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. And when I first read that, I thought, pardon? What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. Is that a statement of science? No. So you cannot know it. So it's true, it's false. Now that's very important. It's incoherent. Now, if it was true that science was the only way to truth, you'd have to shut half the departments in this university, wouldn't you? You'd have to shut history, economics, languages, linguistics, art, and all the humanities. It's a nonsense idea that science is the only way to truth, yet many people are propagating it. Hawking, in his recent book with Mlodinov, said, scientists are now the torchbearers of truth in this generation. Well, the torchbearers of some truth. So my first point is this. One, scientism is false. That is the idea that science is the only way to truth. Secondly, scientific explanation is limited. Thirdly now, there are different levels of explanation. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a Ford motor car engine. Suppose it's here. And I say to you, I'm going to offer to you two explanations of it. The first one is automobile engineering and the law of internal combustion. That's the scientific one. The other explanation is Henry Ford. Please choose. Well, he's chosen Ford, you see. So he's given up on science. But there we are. I go into many schools. I was in Richard Dawkins' old school the day before I came to the States. And the kids looked at me mystified. One of them said, but sir, you can't choose. You need both. I said to him, you know, you're brilliant. Why is it that some professors can't see that? The point is that the explanation in terms of automobile engineering and the law of internal combustion is a scientific explanation that is not in the same category as the agent explanation, Henry Ford. Now, this is crucial to understand what's going on in this debate. You see, Richard Dawkins thinks the God explanation is the same as the scientific explanation, which is exactly the same as suggesting that the Henry Ford explanation is the same as the science explanation. Nonsense. Once you, of course, you hear my illustration, you can see two things. One, the explanation in terms of Henry Ford doesn't conflict or compete with the explanation in terms of automobile engineering and the law of internal combustion. They are complementary levels of explanation. We're totally familiar with this. If I raised my hand like this, I could give you a scientific explanation, or you could in terms of firing of synapses, contraction of muscles, electrochemical discharges, and so on. I could also say, I raised this to make a point and catch your attention because you're falling asleep. You see, those explanations don't conflict. They complement. Now this is crucial because it immediately tells you that the existence, now try to follow me carefully, the existence of a law or a mechanism is not an argument for the non-existence of an agent who designed both of those. It's just not an argument. Philosophers would say those two things lie in a very different category. Now, there's more to be said about explanation, because we are often told, correctly in part, that explanation is always reductionistic. That is, you reduce everything ultimately to physics and chemistry. So that explanation goes from the bottom up. Now, methodological reductionism is something we all use in thinking about a problem. If it's too big for us, we split it up into smaller problems, we think about the smaller problems, and we hope they give us insight on the big problem. You all do that, don't you? This is familiar. The other kind of reductionism is ontological reductionism, which is saying there's more than that, but ultimately everything can be explained bottom up without reduction on the basis of physics and chemistry. And you may have heard me on the internet tell this story, but it's accessible, and you'll see immediately what we're talking about. In my college, at dinner, we have these dinners every week. The snag sometimes is we're told where we can sit. We're not allowed to choose who's sitting with us. And I found myself sitting beside a world-renowned biochemist. And he asked me, as people do in Oxford, what I did. And I said, pure mathematics. So he said, how boring. And he meant it. That was the trouble. And so I tried to make up for it. I said, well, I tried to be. I know my subject is a bit socially inept and very difficult anyway. So I get interested in big problems. He said, what big problems? Well, I said, I'm very interested in the status of the universe. Is it created or not? Oh dear, he said, it's far worse than I thought. He said, listen, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've got nothing to talk about, and we're going to have an absolutely miserable dinner. That's a great start, isn't it? So I said to him, we're going to have a fascinating time. Try me. Well, I said, reductionism is so interesting. So I talked about methodological reductionism and then ontological reductionism. And I said, why don't we do an experiment? He said, what? Here at the dinner table? I said, sure, this is Oxford. I picked up the menu. And on the menu it said, roast chicken. So he said, what's the problem? Well, I said, you're a reductionist, yes. Everything, physics and chemistry, yes. Well, I said, have a go at this. R-O-A-S-T. Yes, he said, that's roast. I said, how did you know that those marks meant roast and that they have meaning? They're signs, semyon and Greek. There's a semiotic dimension to that collection of 5 marks, isn't there? They carry meaning. So I said, okay, here's my question to you. You're a reductionist, yes. An ontological reductionist, yes. Well, have a go at that then. Explain to me the semiotics of those letters in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And his wife was sitting beside him, and she rather too loudly said, get out of that if you can. But he didn't try. Stunningly honest. He said something that I've heard it since from similar professors, but it was the first time. He said, it can't be done. And I was so amazed I played devil's advocate, which for some Irishmen is quite easy actually. I said, physics and chemistry have only been going 500 or 600 years. He said, it doesn't matter. You cannot explain those marks and their meaning without an intelligence. And it isn't an intelligence of the gaps either. Now this is crucially important. You see, physics and chemistry have a certain level of explanatory power. And it's not within, as you can see, and as he can see, it's not within the explanatory power of physics and chemistry to cope with meaning. And the moment you see marks, your name written, 6 letters of your name may be written on the sand, you immediately infer that there's an intelligence involved, don't you? So your explanation does not proceed now reductionistically. You're explaining what you see in terms of something more complex than the thing you're seeing. And Richard Dawkins doesn't like that, you see, because it's got to go from the simple to the complex in every area. It does in many areas, but I made the point to him. If you argue, as he does in his books, and the others all follow him in saying this, God is no explanation of anything, because by definition he's more complex than the thing you're explaining. That sounds terrific until you analyse it. So I made the point to Richard Dawkins. I came across a book. It was quite complex. It's called The God Delusion. It's 400 pages long. So I asked about its origin. And someone suggested to me that its origin was in the mind of Richard Dawkins, which is much more complicated. So I dismissed that explanation as being totally invalid on the basis of Dawkins' own argument. Well, it's nonsense, isn't it? Wherever language occurs, ladies and gentlemen, we get an exception to the reductionistic simple to complex argument. It gets much more interesting than that. If you can deduce mind from the 6 letters of your name in the sand, what are you going to say about the 3.5 billion letters of the human genetic code? Because they're semiotic. They're codons, you know, A, G, G, C, T. They code for proteins. They've got a semiotic dimension. And isn't it interesting? I find it fascinating that the same people who will deduce instantly from ROAST that a mind's behind it will look at the longest word we've ever discovered, and whatever physical processes and natural process are involved, there are many involved in printing a menu, they put it down to chance and necessity, full stop, and don't mention mind. Something odd is going on, I think. Of course there's something going on, and it's obvious. Let's come back to these worldviews that I talked about. You see, the problem is in this area, and in this area essentially alone, worldview can influence the way in which you interpret scientific data. There are very few areas of science where this happens. You can't deduce Maxwell's equations from a worldview. You can't deduce it from atheism, Christianity, Hinduism, or anything else. But you can deduce that all explanation must be bottom-up from atheism, because there's no top-down causation ultimately, you see? So what's at stake is huge. It's not merely a scientific analysis, it's the whole philosophy of naturalism that's at stake. And that's, of course, what makes it very important. Now, the next thing that comes is that Dawkins and co. think that the problem with people like me is that we have faith in God. I'm a man of faith, apparently. And that's not a compliment, it's a massive insult. Because to be a man of faith means I believe for there's no evidence. Now you need to watch for this. The concept of faith has been subtly redefined. It's even got into Webster's dictionary. It's not quite into the OED yet, but it'll get there. Faith, noun, believing where there's no evidence. Now follow me here, because this is very important. See, faith is the great delusion. And it's a dangerous delusion, says Dawkins, because it means believing where there's no evidence. Now I agree with him. Believing where there's no evidence is very dangerous. But that's blind faith. It's not faith in its normal sense. If you look up the word faith, the English word comes from the Latin fides, which is the same meaning as its Greek context pistis, and it means trust, reliance on authority or information, and so on. And we all know what that means. You have reasons for trusting your friends, don't you? You just don't trust everybody. You trust various teachers to tell you facts because they've got some kind of track record and authority with you. All of us spend a lot of our time sifting evidence. Can we trust that person, or can we trust this bit of information? Isn't that true? We all know what evidence-based faith is. Now along comes Richard Dawkins, and he claims that faith is A, a religious concept, and B, it means believing where there's no evidence. He is dangerously wrong on both points. Now, I cannot speak for other religions. They've every right to speak for themselves. I speak as a Christian. So the first question to ask, is the Christian faith blind or evidence-based? And the answer is given all over the place. Let's take an example. In the first century, John the Apostle writing says, many of the signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, these are the signs, semeion, from which we get semiotics. If I didn't believe that my faith was grounded in evidence, all kinds of evidence, objective and subjective, and you can ask me about that in the question time. Now this is enormously important. So the first point is, whatever other things Dawkins is thinking about, the Christian faith is evidence-based. But worse still, this subtle redefinition of the concept of faith steers people away from realizing that faith is an essential part of science. Did you realize that? Einstein, no less, said that he couldn't imagine a scientist without that kind of faith. He used the word faith. What was he talking about? He wasn't talking about faith in God, of course. He was talking about faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Belief that science could be done. Not one of you would be here studying science if you didn't believe it could be done. Isn't that interesting? Faith is utterly essential to the scientific endeavor. Now, of course, it's evidence-based. We see the results of science, and that reinforces, but we nevertheless have to keep holding on to that it can be done. But now comes the interesting bit. Why would you believe that science could be done? What do you do science with? Well, I do it with what I call my mind. And some of my atheistic colleagues won't allow me the use of the word mind because they say my mind is my brain. So let's follow their track for a moment. What is the mind? It is the brain. What is the brain? Well, to cut a long story short, it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process that didn't have it in mind. Okay? Let me put it to you. I suppose that if you own iPads, iPods, and everything else that begins with I, if you knew that your iPad or iMac was the end product of a purposeless, mindless process, would you use it or trust it? Of course you wouldn't. And here's the irony of the contemporary situation. And it's my biggest objection to atheism. It hasn't anything to do with God at all. It's to do with the fact that the logical consequence of bottom-up explanation is to undermine any warrant for trust in the rationality I need to do science. Now, people are beginning to see this in a very big and interesting way, as you can check on the internet. C.S. Lewis, years ago, made the point. He said, if thought is the undesigned and irrelevant product of cerebral motions, what reason have we to trust it? And Alvin Plantinga, one of the most distinguished philosophers in the world, who lives here in America, just retired from Notre Dame, he says, if Dawkins is right, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. Now listen to this. This is a very interesting statement. Dawkins' biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. C.S. Lewis, again, it would be impossible to accept naturalism if we really and consistently believe naturalism. And the most interesting, of course, of all is the recent book by Thomas Nagel, who is an atheist now. Lewis was a Christian, but Nagel is one of your current most distinguished philosophers in New York. He's written a book with an explosive subtitle. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. The book is called Mind and Cosmos, but the subtitle is Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. What? And this is a top philosopher. His argument is this one: that if it were true, it undermines the very rationality we need to know it's true. And this is now flowing into mainstream academic thinking. And it is utterly fascinating to me. It's happened just over the last few years. You see, explanation. I want an explanation of why explanation is possible. Atheism doesn't give it to me. I sometimes make the point that naturalism doesn't only shoot itself in the foot, it shoots itself in the brain, which is usually permanently fatal. But now compare that explanation, which isn't an explanation, with the God explanation. As Newton and co believe that it's worth doing science. Why can science be done? Because there's a rational creator. And the reason we can do science is that the universe out there was created by the same creator who created the human mind in here. That's why it can be done. Now, that is an inference to the best explanation. Infinitely better than the other explanation that shoots all explanations in the brain, as I said. Now, here comes the interesting bit that'll interest some of you information scientists. See, we live in the information age. Now, I've been touching on this without using the word information. Information in the word roast. Information in your name on the beach. Information in DNA. Now, materialism believes that the only stuff in the universe is physical. A lot of people believe that. But information isn't physical. Information is not material. Its carriers are often material. But information itself is not material. And the irony of the current situation in theoretical physics and elsewhere is that we come to see, many physicists will say this now, that information is not reducible to physics and chemistry. We must treat it as an irreducible entity in its own right. That's point one. Point two, it's not material. So where did it come from? You see, physics itself is now pointing to the fact that you cannot reduce the universe to materialistic explanations only. There is more to it. Now, this is a huge topic, and it bears a lot of exploration. Now, what have we been talking about so far? Let me sum up a little bit. First of all, we saw history gives a pointer. The meteoric rise of science connected intimately with the Christian faith in the creator God, in the rational intelligibility of the universe. That was the first thing. The second thing, that this opposition between science and God comes from misunderstanding, number one, the nature of God, and number two, the nature of explanation. Okay? And then we notice that there are certain things that we explain very well reductionistically, but once language occurs, you cannot do that. The explanation tends to be more complex than the thing you're explaining. And of course you accept that. Those of you who are archaeologists, for instance, you go out, you see a stone, is it windswept or is it an artifact? The artifact explanation is much more complex than the thing you're explaining. But that's not a science stopper. You then say, what sort of a civilization produced this? We're familiar with this. The point is, though, once it gets to the deeper level, people run away from the inference because, of course, it raises the God question. And you're not allowed to raise the God question. But then that is not following the evidence where it leads. And when I was brought up to be a scientist, I thought the essence of science was to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Isn't it odd that certain areas are designated as no-go areas? Now, I've spoken for 43 minutes and 48 seconds now, and I just want to make a couple more points, if I may, and then throw it over to your question. One of the interesting things that's happening now is that Lawrence Krauss has teamed up with Richard Dawkins. He's a professor of physics from ASU, and I've debated him and discussed things with him. And he's got A Universe from Nothing as his book. And you will know that in Hawking's book, and a lot of people these days are trying to desperately, in my view, trying to get a universe from nothing. Now this is a most interesting thing to me, because I was alive in the 1960s, believe it or not. You weren't. I remember when the first evidence for a hot Big Bang came in. It was fiercely resisted in British science. And the editor of Nature, which is the most famous periodical in science in the world, he said, we can't go down this track of a beginning to the universe. Look, it'll give far too much support to people who believe the Bible. So that major scientific advance was resisted because it supported the Bible, which is a very odd thing. And it's odd, isn't it, as I pointed out to some very famous physicists not long ago, that people criticize the Bible, and yet it's been said there was a beginning for millennia, not simply centuries. And I was cheeky enough to suggest to some of these physicists, if they had taken the Bible seriously, they might just have looked for evidence for a beginning before they did. So it talks about a beginning, but now science and the Bible converge. It raises a massive problem. If there isn't a God, and the universe, space-time started, what caused it? Now, some scientists say, well, it's just a brute fact. And as Paul Davis, who's not a theist, points out, that's a very odd reaction to people that are always looking for cause and effect. To say that the whole thing is just a brute fact is a cop-out. So what do you do? Well, you have to now get a universe from nothing. So how do you do that? Well, that is a wondrous thing to behold. How do you do it? Well, one way of doing it is to make statements like this. And I come back to where I started, with Stephen Hawking. Rejecting God, he says, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. You got that? And when I read that, I thought, come again? Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. Contradiction number one. Interesting, isn't it? Because there is a law of gravity, not even because there is gravity. But what would a law of gravity mean if gravity doesn't exist? And now you uncover a total confusion that laws are created. Newton's law of motion never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe, did it? People with cues do that. Laws don't move anything. They simply describe what's there. But it's called creative accounting. So you won't know what that means because you suffered it. It is a total nonsense. And C.S. Lewis, again, as usual, brilliant, says, you can do sums from here to eternity. If you add 1 and 1, we get 2, but unless you give me $1 and $1, I'll never have $2. Because mathematics creates nothing. And yet here's Peter Atkins, Paul Davis saying it does, and Hawking suggesting it virtually. But it's even more interesting than that. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. The universe will create itself. If I say X creates Y, what does that mean? It means if I assume X, I'll get Y, isn't that right? And if I say X creates X, what does that mean? It means that nonsense remains nonsense, even if high-powered physicists are talking it. If I have X, I'll get X. It is sheer nonsense. Now, what interests me about that is, ladies and gentlemen, that these are some of the top intellectuals in the world leaving the subject of science and going into philosophy. And Hawking, in the book that I quoted from, says philosophy is dead. That was a very dangerous thing to say. especially if you start using arguments like the one I just used. There's a triple level of self-contradiction in that sentence. It's very clever to invent a sentence like that. I challenge you tonight, if you can't sleep, invent another sentence with 3 levels of self-contradiction that sounds plausible. Lawrence Krauss doesn't do much better, forgive me. What would you do with this statement? Because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if it's defined as the absence of something. I am intrigued that people will resort to such sheer nonsense that even school kids wouldn't write, to try to avoid the obvious conclusion that you must have a cause for the universe, and the cause is God. Now there are lots more questions, but you're going to ask them, so thank you very much.
Again later. My name's Adam. Helped kind of coordinate part of this event with a lot of the other sponsors that Liz mentioned at the beginning. And right now, before we move to question and answer, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and respond to the survey. So we will have more, and if you want to add something to it at the very end, you can. As all you know, we were supposed to hold the event Tuesday night, and originally Dr. Lennox and his wife were scheduled to stay Wednesday night. But then when Wednesday came and left and the Russell House was closed, they offered, without even us asking, to stay an additional night. Take your questions. Again, please do respect the style in which he would like to do it. And Dr. Lennox, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I find with an audience like this, everybody is interested in everybody else's questions. And so I give the audience a chance to hear the spectrum of questions before I answer any of them. And that enables me to relate them to one another and to address in a much better way the concerns of the people in the room. Now it's a Q&A. The questions you will ask, probably each one will deserve a lengthy lecture. You're not going to get it. What you're going to get is simply the way I would approach such a question, briefly. So it's going to be disappointing. But let's try. So put up your hand, keep your question short, because your question, time taken, will take time away from the next person's question. Keep it on the topic. I'm not here to discuss the politics of Northern Ireland and so on and so forth. We're here to talk about can science and God coexist. So stand up so that I can hear you. Then we'll take you first. And just your question, I write it down.
You talked a lot about how the idea that surrounding you believe in God, that modern scientists don't. What do you think caused the change? And the scientists before believed in a God, the scientists now.
Okay, thank you. What caused change? Okay. I'm going to go from side to side, to be fair. You, please.
Can I? All right. So you're talking about ontological reductionism, and you mentioned that God was beyond explanation. Well, continuing from that, if God is beyond explanation and Christianity is a religion that kind of like describes or explains the nature of God, religions, whatever, isn't Christianity essentially reductionist?
Okay. 3, a person right at the back standing up. I'll reward you for standing up for the whole time, like I've done.
Well, I loved all the points on explanation. You did ask the question, explain explanation. I was just wondering how that doesn't fall into the God of the gap. If the Christian God would thus be the gap filling in the mind processes that allow us to explain things.
Okay, thank you. 4.
You said that people often contort themselves into wild shapes in order to avoid the obvious conclusion. Why do you think they do that?
Okay. Was that your question or your voice? Very good. He looks a bright lad. I thought he'd asked it too. Okay, another one in the front now.
You talked earlier in your speech about when you went to the university to test your beliefs, whether or not Christianity was culturally conditioned or if it was something that was rational and held up. If a person here tonight is either atheist or theist, what advice from that journey that you went down would you give on how to test your own culturally conditioned beliefs? So if a person is an atheist, how would they test to see if their belief is true or
Okay.
vice versa for the opposite?
Thank you. 5. Okay, we'll try the middle now. A lady there. Thank you.
What's your biggest question currently, and how do you go about answering it?
Do you know that's clever, isn't it? You deserve an answer, you do. You do. Yeah.
You talked about traveling to Russia and other states where atheism became more prevalent. What was the big outcome you noticed going
What
there?
was?
What was the big outcome of traveling to like Russia where atheism is more prevalent?
Big outcome, you mean for me?
Well, what did you notice for the country?
Oh, okay. 8, number 8. Now, wait a minute, where do we go? We better give you in the front there.
One of your main criticisms of atheism was that you argued that something cannot come from nothing. But couldn't you then take that argument and apply it to God and say that something would have had to create God?
You could. Thank you. Oh, right.
All right. Well, you must have faith, or else the universe would collapse. But my question is, even though there's many people that do not believe that there is a source and that we all believe we are all part of a united consciousness, then why do we have to put? I remember you said earlier that creating something, that it's a marvelous thing, we have the right to do so, but creating a label and then putting yourself towards that label, which only causes the world separation of the world, how is that a positive?
Separation of the world in what sense?
As in the sense that you are...
And various religions fight against each other. That
Yes,
kind of thing.
for example,
Okay.
crusades and other
I've got it.
conflict.
Okay, now who's next? You look as if you want to be next.
You talked about science pointing to God, but how did it point specifically to the Christian God?
Yeah. Okay, we're going to have to stop with you at the back.
You said that God is not a God of the gaps. And you said that in that way, when science fills all the gaps, there's no room for God. So do you believe that science can fill all the gaps, or do we have to, on some evidence, make some leaps to reach our final conclusions about God?
Okay, thank you very much. We'll have to stop with that because some of these would demand a great deal of time. So I'll go through them roughly in the order in which they came, but not completely. I talked a lot about Newton was the first question. Why is the situation today as it is? Well, in order to answer that, I think most historians and philosophers of science would talk to you about a gradual disappearing, so to speak, of the idea of God from intellectual activity as a result of cultural upheavals like the Enlightenment, where God, first of all, was pushed back in deism to be God who started it off but doesn't get involved, and then God disappears altogether. And that would be one reason. Another reason, of course, would be the fact that this isn't simply an intellectual issue, it is also a moral issue. And Christianity is not just a theory. God, according to Christianity, is a person. And we are told we are created in his image. He makes moral demands. And there are some very honest atheists in the world today who just tell me, I don't want there to be a God, because I am not prepared to change my lifestyle. So there's a huge mix of historical development. I mean, if you think of the experience of the French with the corrupt church, it's not surprising that they moved towards atheism. And it's not surprising that many of my contemporaries in Northern Ireland, watching so-called Protestants fighting so-called Catholics, said, well, if that's God, forget it. So there are lots of reasons, but I've been approaching tonight the reasons that go down at the intellectual level that result from confusion. But the moral side tends to obfuscate it a little bit. Now the next one about ontological reductionism, you said I had said that God is beyond explanation. Isn't Christianity reductionist? Well, I didn't say God is beyond explanation. He is, of course, in a very real sense, but that does not mean we can know nothing about God. And the very last question, which I'll come to in a moment, which said, how does science point towards the Christian God? The notion of how God explains himself is, of course, at the heart of Christianity. It's got nothing to do with science directly, as we'll see in a minute. But the claim is, at least, and we have to see what the claim is before we can accept it or reject it, is that God has revealed himself in Christ so that we can know something about him. So it's not all one way. It's not the human search for God. If Christianity is true, it's the exact opposite. It's God revealing himself in terms that we ourselves can understand. And I wouldn't know what it meant to say Christianity was reductionist, because its ultimate explanation is the most complicated being of all, who is God. So that's how I would begin to approach that. Now the next question related to that, explaining explanation and the God of the gaps. I think it's very important to realize that the God explanation, I'm going to repeat this, I've said it before, but it takes a while to sink in, is not the same kind of explanation as a scientific explanation. So, in one sense, the gaps don't arise. God is the explanation of what we do understand, as much as he is of what we don't understand. And the point I was making is, the wonderful fact that we can mathematically describe the universe is, to my mind, evidence for the existence of God based on what we do understand. It's not a God of the gaps at all. Now, to go to my analogy, which is why I told it to you, because it's so clear, of the menu. Just think about this when you raise the God of the gaps question. Is it a mind of the gaps that you postulate when you see roast chicken written on the page? Of course it isn't. What it is the only explanation of the nature of the gap, is what demands an explanation in terms of intelligence. They're not an intelligence of the gaps. They're an intelligence demanded by the semiotic nature of the situation. If you like, it's a gap, of course, because physics and chemistry can't explain it. And in that sense, my teacher of quantum physics at Cambridge, John Polkinghorne, says we are unashamedly people of the gaps. I, in my book, God's Undertaker, forgive a bit of advertising, if you want to follow this a bit more, I've talked about good gaps and bad gaps. By bad gaps, I mean the gaps that science closes, like the gods of thunder. By good gaps, I mean the gaps that science opens, because it hasn't got the explanatory power. And if you want to read the later chapters of that, I hope you might find them helpful. Now, why do people take wild steps to avoid the obvious conclusion? I think my first answer is where I would start there. That it shows that the problem is not rational. I had a very good bit of advice from an Irish farmer many years ago, and I give it to you, it'll save you a lot of time. If a person can't see reason, reason isn't their problem. Think about it. It's absolutely right. If a person cannot see reason, reason isn't their problem. It must be somewhere else, and it's often located morally. Or simply, I don't want there to be a God, and I'm going to explain it away any way I can. Like Richard Dawkins' public profession of a preference for little green men creating the universe and God. You see, there is that business of the human will and the implications of there being a God that does rather change the situation. Now, what was the big outcome from Russia? Well, there were many big outcomes from Russia. One of the saddest was to see how atheism destroyed people's capacity to think. I mean that seriously. I had many Russian intellectuals say, look, you have to go more slowly. We have not got the intellectual apparatus even to process your arguments. They were very interested. The other thing that has marked me, and I'll come back to that in a later question, is that they have experienced, of course, what mercifully we haven't, the Gulag. And many a Russian intellectual has said to me, we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. We discovered we couldn't, but it was too late. That's a devastating indictment. Ideas of consequences, ladies and gentlemen. Serious consequences. And that's why it's so important at university to investigate your worldview, which was one of the other questions. Test your beliefs in university. What advice would I give you? Well, play Socrates. If you're an atheist, get a hold of some of these Christians. I think there may be one or two. And give them a rough time. I mean, in a pleasant way. It's a unique opportunity for you to find out what makes them tick. Now, I started in Christianity, so I did the opposite, and I'm still doing it. I'm still trying to, and succeeding mostly, to befriend some of the leading atheists in the world to find out what makes them tick. And I would suggest to those of you who are Christians, there's nothing like engaging with other worldviews to make you check your own. Because we are not, as Christians, exempt from coming up with the absurd ideas and ridiculous ideas. And sometimes we caricature the views of our atheist and agnostic friends, which is why, you didn't notice that perhaps, I mentioned the word friendship. I attempt in every case where it's possible to become friends with the person that I'm debating or discussing. Because it's only when we have an atmosphere of mutual respect that you can really find out what people think. And it can be very enlightening for an atheist or a Christian to spend time and make friends with people that don't share the worldview and do a journey together, learning from one another. Ultimately, of course, you have to decide for yourself what is true. Now, we have several questions that relate to each other. I'll deal with the easy one first. The questioner who asked, what usually gets asked at these meetings because it's so widespread, the thing is, if you've got God as creator, logic would tell you you have to ask who or what created God. You know that question, don't you? Who created the creator that created the creator that created the creator, and so on. It goes on to ad absurdum. Therefore it's nonsense, so we forget it. But let's do a bit of logical analysis, ladies and gentlemen. Who created the creator? Let me extract from it. Who or what created X? What does that mean? What assumption is hidden in there? Well, if I say what created X, I'm assuming X was created, aren't I? Can you see that? It's what philosophers call a complex question. There's an assumption hidden in it, which really rules out a whole spectrum of answers. You see, if you say who created God, you're assuming God is created. Now, let me put this into context, if Richard Dawkins' book was called The Created God's Delusion, I don't think anybody would have read it. Because I don't need him to tell me, nor do you, that created gods are a delusion. We usually call them idols. So the question does not apply to an uncreated God. Of course not. But the central claim of Christianity, and incidentally, Judaism and Islam, is that God is eternal. He wasn't created. So to ask who created God means you haven't a clue what God you're talking about. All right? Now, there's a sting in this, you see, because when Dawkins put this question to me in public, and you can see it on YouTube, I said to him, you think this is a sensible question? Well, it does apply to created God, so let me ask you the same question. You believe the universe created you. Who created your creator? I'm still waiting for the answer, and that's 8 years ago. You can see? Now, philosophically, what's behind the question is important. It's a question about the nature of ultimate reality. Do the questions go back forever, who created it and so on, or not? Well, I find on both sides they don't. My atheist friends usually believe that the universe is where the questions stop, or the multiverse, or something like that, or mass energy, or a quantum vacuum. But they stop. On the Christian side, they stop with God. So the question is not, is there an ultimate reality? The question we have to decide on is which reality is ultimate. So that's the way I would approach that. I was amazed, incidentally, to find that Richard Dawkins made that question the heart of his book, The God Delusion. Just amazed. But anyway, there we are. Now, a question about labels, religious wars. What is the hardest question you have to ask? How does science point to the Christian God? See, the value of collective questions means you can see that these relate to one another. What's the hardest question? Oh, it's obvious what the hardest question is. It's the problem of pain and suffering. That's the hardest question, isn't it? It's the hardest question for atheists, Gnostics, people of any religion than me. We're all in the same boat, aren't we? And it gets asked more and more. The last time I was in the States, I did 5 of these forums in a week. 3 of them, they insisted, were on this topic. And you could watch them. And if you want to see in detail what I believe about this, just Google my name in New Zealand. Because I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake and had to meet people that had lost their relatives and so on. So you can see that there's a whole page of TV interviews and so on and so forth. So let me approach these 3 questions all together, although they may not seem to be related. I will first take the one about religions and conflict from over here. Because I come from Northern Ireland and I get this all the time, how can you possibly be a Christian and come from North of Ireland for a start? Why didn't you chuck away your faith? Well, if I'm asked directly what I think of what happened in Northern Ireland, I'm utterly ashamed of it. That's the first thing I confess to you. Utterly ashamed of it. Ashamed that the name of Christ has ever been associated with an AK-47 or a bomb. Why? Because, ladies and gentlemen, of the very simple fact that Christ himself repudiated violence. And people who take up guns and bombs in his name are not following him, they are disobeying him. Now here's where history is crucial. There are multiple records of the trial of Christ, not simply of his crucifixion and his resurrection, but of his trial. And it's fascinating to see. Ironically, as I put to Christopher Hitchens, the very thing that he accuses the Christian church of, violence and so on, is what Christ was accused of. You surely know that he was put on trial for fomenting political violence. He was declared innocent. Why? The Roman procurator Pilate was utterly allergic to anybody that claimed to be a Messiah, claiming to be stirring up violence, so he put Jesus on trial and had a conversation with him. And wanted to know what sort of a king he was. Are you a king then? He said. Yes, I am, said Jesus, but not the sort you're thinking about. My kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise, my servants would have been fighting that I should not be delivered to the Jews. And when Pilate heard that, he went out and said Jesus was innocent, especially when he added this: to this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And Pilate's reaction to that was the famous question, what is truth? He could see, he was a hardened Roman soldier, that a man who said he was king of the truth was no threat to the political stability of the system. If at bottom there's no justice, there's no good, there's no evil, DNA is just is, and we dance to its music. Well, if that is true, that's the end of all morality, of course. Now, if you abolish God because of the problem of evil, philosophically, I want to ask you where you get your concept of evil from. Now, that's a route we can go on, and I've dealt with that in my book, Gunning for God. That's a big topic. But I'm going to leave that aside because no matter about the philosophy of the thing, we still feel the pain, and our minds demand answers. So, my atheist friends have got rid of the problem, they claim. I notice they haven't got rid of the suffering. It's still there. I notice they have got rid of all hope, by definition. Because those people who've suffered and died, that's it, according to atheism. There is utterly no hope. They've got rid of justice, or any possibility of it, because the vast majority of human beings haven't got justice in this life, and they're not going to get justice in the one to come. So there are immense problems with atheism. It is utterly bleak, and when I put that to Dawkins, he said, that doesn't prove it's not true. I said, it doesn't prove it's false either. It doesn't prove it is true either. We've got to look for deeper evidence, ladies and gentlemen. I have a problem with evil. In a sense, the atheist doesn't, but I do not find her explanation or his convincing. So how do I face it? Well, I tell you, with great difficulty and with great sympathy. But I think there's a way in. And here's the way in. Science can only take us so far. And the question asked me at the end from the front is highly relevant. You know, you're standing there as a Christian, but most of your arguments tonight have supported theism. That's entirely correct. You see, the evidence for Christianity goes beyond the scientific. If I'd had time, which I didn't, nobody asked me the question, so I'm not going to answer it, I would have faced the question of miracles. Because one of the supreme evidences for me that Christianity is true is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And of course, as you know, that runs head on with David Hume's idea that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. I think that Hume was wrong, demonstratively wrong, and that his leading exponent before he died came to the same conclusion. So you can read about that if you look at the last couple of chapters of Gunning for God. And that is one way in which science can approach Christianity. But you see, Christianity is specific. It makes claims about a special time in history. It's also experiential. So we've got to go beyond the strict limits of natural sciences. We've got to go to history and experience, which are equally important, of course, and even more important for most of us in everyday life. There's a subjective and an objective side to it. Now, coming to this problem of evil, we all know that the philosophers, we've probably done it for hours at a time until we got fed up. Surely if there's a good old powerful God, he could, would, should, might, and all that. You know that kind of argument. And we're never satisfied with it. You notice that? Well, when you're never satisfied with trying to answer a question, it's best to change the question. And my question is this: granted that it's so, we look at life, we see it's on the one hand raw, ugly, barbed wire and guns and bullets and bombs and disease. On the other side, beauty. It's a bit like Coventry Cathedral. I don't know whether you know of Coventry Cathedral. Beautiful cathedral, bombed during the war. You go in, it's a bomb site, but you can still see traces of its beauty. Life is like that. I mean, we're unbelievably privileged sitting in this room tonight. You know that, but it's very hard to grasp it. Since I started this talk tonight, how many 100,000 kids have died as a result of human activity? So what are you going to do? So my first approach is to admit that it's raw, it's horrible, but there are traces of beauty here and there. So here's my question. Granted it's like that, is there any evidence anywhere in the universe that there is a God who can be trusted with it? And my answer is there is, ladies and gentlemen. Because at the heart of Christianity, you know there is a cross. What's that all about? Well, the claim is that Jesus was God incarnate. God has come to visit our planet. So the question, just follow me. You may disagree with it and agree with it, but if you want to understand the answer to the question, you must at least first listen to what the claim is. Then you can think about whether you agree with it or not. And the claim is that God became human in Jesus Christ. So the question that we might ask is, what is God doing on a cross? And the answer? Well, many answers, but at least surely it shows us that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. I can begin to trust a God like that. And secondly, the one who was on the cross didn't stay on the cross. He was buried and he rose the third day, which means, ladies and gentlemen, if it's true, that death is not the end. There is to be a judgment. That is a magnificent thing, if you think about it. If there's no ultimate judgment that's utterly fair and right, then in the end Hitler gets away with it. Murders 6 million Jews and then just puts a gun to its head and that's it. There's nothing. Isn't it interesting that each one of us has a moral conscience? We're moral beings. We cry for justice, and yet some of the theories we're developing at our universities cancel the very idea of justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. If that's true, the shooters wasn't Georgia Tech. We're just dancing to the music of their DNA. That's the end of morality. Ideas of consequences. But you see, I don't believe that's the end of morality. Because the wonderful thing is that there is to be a judgment. And the Bible tells me, and I believe it because I think there's evidence for it, that Christ will judge. It's humans to be judged. It's a human who is God who will do the judging. Utterly fair. That makes life look very differently, doesn't it? I would suggest to you, if you could see what God has done with those innocent children who died since the start of this lecture, you wouldn't have any more questions. Good night and thank you very much.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.